We have two student presenters, and the first one is Drouhard.
Hello, thank you. All right, so the poem I'm presenting is actually based on a painting. Don't take your phone out now, but afterwards, if you'd like to understand my poem a little bit more, it'd be super cool if you would look up a picture of the painting. The painting is by Francisco Goya. It's called Saturn Devouring His Sun. And just a little bit of information about the painting. Francisco Goya was an artist a really long time ago, and towards the end of his life, he suffered from an amount of psychological decline, and he painted 14 paintings on the walls of his house. These were called the 14 black paintings. They were oil paintings. And when people found these paintings, they found them after Francisco Goya had died. And because these paintings had never been intended to be presented, they didn't have names. And so the archaeologists, the people who found them, kind of just named them themselves, and the painting I'm talking about, Saturn Devouring His Sun, they assumed that it had been named after the Greek myth. So, this is Saturn Devouring His Sun. Francisco Goya's painting is not of Saturn devouring his sun. He painted in the dark where no one would see, and when they saw, they explained, made it make sense, made it nice, a myth, a monster. Goya did not paint a myth, he did not paint a monster, he painted a man. He painted a woman. I see the man, the father. His hands are mine as they hold her waist, his jaw is mine. As it opens too wide, I feel the ache in my cheeks. I see the woman, the sun, I see her body in my mirror, feel her skin in my own. I feel the woman, her body in my hands, her arm in my mouth, the soft squish of flesh before my teeth clack against bone. I feel the man, unfathomably large, his fingers dig into my waist, I cannot see him. I am the man, I have ripped her head away, I have come back for more of her softness, her warmth. I am the woman, I feel his teeth on my arm, the stretch, the pain, the crack as he bites. I am both, victim and victor, eaten and full. I rip my own flesh with my own teeth, taste my own blood on my own tongue. I am both, hunger and hungry, man and woman, father and son. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Our second student presenter is Ava Koot.
Hi, I'm Ava. It's my senior year, and I've been doing the Writers Expo since I was a freshman, and I kind of decided to go into it a little bit differently than I have the past years, in trying to both talk about my life and like the thing that kind of takes over my life, which is my art. And this year in my portfolio, I went through the journey of Dante through Dante's Divine Comedy. And strangely enough, it overlapped with my own personal life going through senior year a lot more than I thought it would. So this poem is just kind of about my thoughts and questions throughout this year. It's called A Quest for Meaning. It always starts with questions, small at first, like pebbles in your pocket, rattling as softly as you move. But soon they grow heavier, stones pressing into your palms, an ache soon settling into your bones. Where do you belong? What are you meant to do with this fleeting time? You search for it in the obvious places, pages of books, the wisdom of others, the lines etched into the faces of those who came before you. But nothing quite fits right. And the world hums with meaning, but every time you reach for it, it slips through your fingers, dissolving like the mist of the morning sun. So you keep walking. You chase meaning down winding roads, listening through crowds and streets and quiet rooms. listening for it in the hush of the ocean, in the steady rhythm of your heartbeat. Some days you think you found it, in the glimmer of the horizon, finally a thread to follow, but then it shifts, an illusion dissolving into the heat, and doubt creeps in. Maybe you took a wrong turn, maybe there was never a path to follow at all. Maybe meaning is a trick of the light only other people can find. You slow down. You wonder if you should turn back, if standing still is easier than chasing something that keeps slipping away. The questions get louder, heavier, pressing into your chest. But then, a moment catches you off guard. A stranger holds the door open, and for a second, kindness feels like a direction. Someone laughs at your joke, really laughs, and the weight of it on your chest eases. The sky splits open at sunrise, colors spilling over the earth like a promise. You finish something you thought you couldn't. Someone calls your name, and for once it feels like home. And maybe, just maybe, this is it. Because meaning isn't waiting for you at the end of the road. It's already here, in the moments we don't expect, the quiet ones that hum beneath all the noise, the discovery of ourselves in the smallest things, the shared laughter, the peace found in silence, the satisfaction of a task well done. Meaning is not one destination, but 1,000 small discoveries, woven together by the threads of experience and held together by the courage to keep going, even when the end isn't clear. The road may twist, but we're never truly lost. Every step forward, no matter how unsure, takes us closer to the version of ourselves that is always waiting to be found. So walk on, not because you have all the answers, but because you're still asking the questions, because you're still moving, still becoming. And that is enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Ava. And now a little bit about our featured guest. Our guest today is an award-winning freelance travel writer who has reported from 7 continents for publications like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, Food and Wine, and others. She is a contributing editor at Condé Nast Traveler and is on the faculty of the Columbia School of Journalism's Columbia Publishing course. Her work was chosen for the Best American Travel Writing in 2021, and she has won numerous awards, including an honorable mention as Travel Journalist of the Year in the 2021 Lowell Thomas Travel Journalism Awards. She is a disciple of maps, a connoisseur of global junk food, and a hoarder of hotel pens, and a master at sleeping through long-haul flights. Please welcome Sarah Khan.
Oh, there it is. Hi, everyone. Let me just get set up here a bit. And let's see if this works. Can you guys hear me? Do I need to stand here? Okay. Yeah. All right. Hi. So my name is Sarah Khan, and I get told over and over that I have a dream job. And you know what? I kind of do. I'm a travel journalist, which means kind of what it sounds like. I get paid to travel all over the world and report back what I see. And my work has taken me to all 7 continents and both poles to write for the New York Times, Condé Nast Traveler, Travel and Leisure, Food and Wine, and many, many other publications. And in fact, if you go to a newsstand right now, I don't know if any of you guys read Bon Appetit, or maybe your parents do. It's a food magazine. That cover story is mine. And also on newsstands right now, I have a story in Time Magazine and a story in Condé Nast Traveler. So I kind of get around. So before we get started, I have a little game I play on my social media where whenever I get to a new country, I make people guess where in the world is Sarah Khan. So I'm gonna try that with you guys. So you don't have to guess exactly where it is, but does anyone have a guess about where in the world this picture might be? Sorry, can you say it louder? Egypt is close. You? Uzbekistan is close, but no, actually not really close, but that's coming up soon. This one is actually the Sahara Desert in Algeria, where I was last year. And any guesses on this one? Not Thailand? Nope. France? Nope. It is in Europe. This is in Bosnia. Sorry, someone say something back there? You're gonna have to speak up, I can't hear you. All right, this is in Bosnia. This is a Sufi monastery on a river. It was absolutely stunning. This one? India. It is India. Anyone know where in India? No, definitely not Mumbai. You don't see that kind of landscape in Mumbai. This is a part of South India called Hampi. It's actually known for these amazing historic temples, but it's also known for this really unique rocky landscape, which is what I'm kind of hanging off of there. And this is me in high school, Sharon, Massachusetts, 1999. And that is me in Antarctica in 2022, which that's actually the year I went to all 7 continents in 6 months. And so I am going to tell you a bit about how I got from Sharon High to Sri Lanka, Uzbekistan, I told you it was coming soon, and somewhere near the North Pole, and many, many other places. So I'm a travel writer, like I said. And there are a lot of different ways to do what I do. And I think I'll tell you a bit about my path, but just know if this is something that sounds interesting to you, there are so many different ways you could be doing it. The world has changed so much since I graduated 25 years ago when social media barely existed. I think when I graduated in high school, I don't think it really existed at all. But the fact that now there are actual jobs at major publications that you could be doing social media at, that was not a thing. So there's a lot of different ways you could do this. But how I got here is, so I was born in Canada. I grew up in Saudi Arabia and India. And my father, when I was living in Saudi Arabia, was working at Saudi Airlines, and my mother was a freelance journalist, writing about travel and culture and food. And so I think because of that early exposure to traveling and to writing as a career, I always knew I wanted to be a journalist. When I was 8 years old and everybody else wanted to be a fireman or a rock star, I was telling everyone I wanted to be a journalist. And I think, like I said, it was just growing up traveling like that and then seeing my mother making a living out of telling stories. I think I just knew right away that's what I wanted to do. But even though I always knew that's what I wanted to do, I didn't actually do a lot about it in high school and college. I did write a little bit for the high school paper and a little bit for the college paper. In college, I majored in English and communications, and then I went to graduate school in journalism and studied magazine journalism at Syracuse, which all great things to do if you want to be a professional writer, but the great thing about journalism is it's something you can learn on the job through internships and through working. So I actually encourage people to explore different things when you're an undergrad. Learn about art history, major in economics. So it's always good to have types of expertise outside of writing. And like I said, you can learn about writing on the job. And so, let's see. So then after grad school, I moved to Boston. And initially, I worked in public relations, which is a slightly different side of the media world, because I just wanted to, pay off my college loans, wasn't really thinking about my career so much just yet. And then after about a year of that, I realized if I was serious about being a journalist, like I had wanted all my career, all my life, I needed to move to New York. And again, this was 20 years ago. Now there's so many different places you can move to be a journalist, and especially I would argue if you want to be a travel journalist, you're probably better off moving somewhere outside of New York for sure. But back then, it was the center of all media, so I knew that if I was serious about being a journalist, that's where I needed to go. So my first job in journalism was I would have taken any kind of job, to be honest. I mean, when you're just getting started, you should not be picky. I would have worked literally at any publication that gave me a job. I got lucky. I was working at a city magazine that was all about fashion and food and cool things happening in New York. So it was a really great way to get exposed to the city when I moved there. But more importantly, it was a very, very small publication. So I was exposed to all different sides of the magazine. When you work at a magazine, you're usually kind of slotted to what your job is, and especially when you're entry level. But because this was a small publication, I was literally writing cover stories and interviewing celebrities within 6 months. Whereas if I'd been at a bigger, more prestigious magazine, I probably wouldn't have been doing things like that for years. And so then a few years after that, I realized I was ready to move on, and that's when I kind of thought, what am I really interested in personally? And as you saw, growing up, traveling all over the world, I knew I wanted to be in travel. So my next big magazine job was at Travel and Leisure magazine, and I worked there for about 5 years, and that was really great to really learn how a travel magazine comes together, to work with some of the top editors in the business to really understand what stories they're interested in. And then a few years after that, I moved to South Africa, and that is where I went freelance for the first time. And you'll hear me talking a lot about on-staff and freelance. Freelance basically means I'm an independent journalist. I write I work for myself and I write for a lot of different publications. When I moved to South Africa, I wondered if I should try to find another full-time job at a magazine there, but I realized that there was an opportunity to tell a lot of stories from that region for publications back home, so I decided to try my luck freelancing, and it was actually a really good call because within 6 months of starting, I was writing for all of my dream publications. I had stories in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, pretty much everywhere I wanted to write for, really focusing on telling stories from the continent. And so then a few years after that, when I moved back to the States, I decided I wanted to stay freelancing. And so that's where my career has taken me to every corner of the world. And it's really just been a great ride. Then after doing, I've been mostly freelance now for about 12 years, but there was 1 year in the middle that I moved to Dubai and became editor-in-chief of Condé Nast Traveler's Middle East edition, which was a really great challenge because I got to be on staff again and actually overseeing an entire publication in a region that I'd grown up in and I love telling stories about. But overall, now that I've been doing this I've been a journalist for 20 years and a travel journalist now for 12 or for 15 actually. And it's just been amazing. I travel hundreds of thousands of miles a year. I've stayed at dozens of hotels a year in magical destinations, and this is actually how I make my living. So now I'm gonna get into what is travel writing specifically. There are a lot of different types of journalism, and this is just one of them. And first, you need to really think about the origins. Travel writing, as we know it today, really kind of is a hangover from the colonial era, when European adventurers would travel around their colonies and just report back what they saw. There was a lot of exoticism and racism embedded in that, and unfortunately that's something we still need to really challenge and fight against today in travel journalism. But now today, as a career, travel journalism is what we call a beat within journalism. It's like a subject matter that you can focus on. And there are a lot of different travel magazines that focus specifically on travel, but then also because it is something that so many people are interested in, there are a lot of sections at major newspapers and magazines that focus on travel, even if that's not what the entire magazine is about. So there's a lot of different places that you can actually be writing these stories. And just like fashion, news, sports, it's just another subject that people cover. And today it's what we call service journalism, which is a way of sharing information and useful tips for travelers to help them plan their trips. And it is a real job. A lot of my friends and family who see my posts on Instagram are just convinced that I'm constantly sipping mocktails by a pool. That is part of it because, when you are writing about travel, you do have to explore the entire destination, and sometimes that includes going to the spa and getting a free massage. But there's a lot more that goes into that. There's a lot of planning, a lot of research. I never just rock up in a place and figure out what I'm doing. I usually have interviews lined up, and then while I'm there, I'm constantly looking to make sure I haven't missed anything. And then when I come home, I actually have to come back and write the thing. So there's a lot more that goes on beyond the few days you spend in a beautiful destination. The cultural impact, I think, is a really important part of travel writing for me personally. Because I always say, people are on all different sides of the spectrum, politically, personally, socially, culturally. And sometimes when it comes to news, that means people get really polarized and will only focus on news websites and magazines and broadcast channels that really speak to them and their own policies and their own beliefs. But when it comes to travel, everyone loves travel, no matter what your background is. And when you're planning a trip, no matter what you think about a publication, you're probably going to go to the New York Times to see what they did in 36 hours in Paris, or go to Condé Nast Traveler. So when you're writing for these publications, you have an opportunity to really reach a broad audience and share your perspective on a destination with a really wide range of readers who might not normally have access to those types of stories. And so you really have the opportunity to bring these destinations and communities and people to life to a big range of people, and I think that is something that's really important to me personally. And I don't know how relevant this is anymore, to be perfectly honest, but I thought I'd just speak a little bit about guidebook writing versus travel journalism, because I don't know if any of you guys use guidebooks at all, or maybe you've seen them, maybe your parents have them, maybe you've seen them at a library, but they're usually these massive books from like Lonely Planet or Photos that have the full, everything you could possibly try to do in a destination. That is a kind of travel writing, and a lot of travel journalists like myself do work on those. But But what they're trying to do is tell you everything. They're trying to give you restaurants for every type of budget. They're trying to give you hotels for every type of traveler. They're trying to tell you museum times and what days they're open, which is important and very useful information. But when it comes to travel writing for a magazine or a newspaper like I do, you're not trying to tell every single thing about a place. You're not trying to cram everything you saw and did into a story. You're trying to take a very specific lens on a destination and share that with people. So while a guidebook might have a section on like the 10 best restaurants in Paris for every budget, a travel story on Paris might actually just talk about the chefs that are kind of on the rise, or like a new culinary trend, or like a neighborhood that's really emerging. So it's more about telling a very specific angle of a destination, not trying to cram everything in. And then something you guys probably are familiar with is content creation and travel influencers. I'm guessing a lot of you probably see that on TikTok and Instagram, or follow YouTube creators. And so that is also a very big part of travel media, but it's really different from what I do. So I just thought I'd explain that, because a lot of times when my friends kind of scroll through and they'll see pictures that I'm posting and pictures that our influencers are posting, they don't really get the difference. So essentially, as a journalist, I'm writing for a magazine or a newspaper, and I'm telling stories about a place for them, and that magazine or newspaper is who pays my bills. If you're a content creator or an influencer, you're typically being paid by a tourism board or a hotel group or a brand, maybe a fashion brand or like an equipment brand, and that's who you're working with, and you're telling their story in your voice to your audience. So they are different. They're both very important parts of travel media, and they're very important to users and readers who are learning about destinations, but they're actually really quite different. And as a journalist, I am I'm not so much a personal brand as I am someone that's working for magazines and newspapers, and I'm beholden to their ethics, policies, and guidelines for their readers. And then on staff versus freelance, you've heard me talk about that a bit already. I'm currently a freelance journalist, which means, like I said, I write for all these different publications. I'm not committed to any one publication, but if you're on staff, which I have been before at Travel and Leisure and Condé Nast Traveler Middle East, then you are responsible only for that publication. There's pros and cons, and I've loved being on both sides of it, but I think what people don't realize, when I was working at Travel and Leisure, everyone thought, oh, you're a travel editor, that's the most glamorous job in the world. And there were a lot of perks, but actually when you open a travel magazine or any magazine, most of the stories in the magazine are actually written by freelance writers like myself, and the editors are sitting there at their desks, and they're not actually getting to go out and explore the world. So if you're looking to do something kind of more like what I'm doing, then you probably want to try to be a freelance writer and not looking for a staff job. Right. There we go, my process. That is actually my laptop in Antarctica when I was on a cruise down there. So I thought then, now I've told you a bit about the industry, I've showed you a couple of stories, or a little bit about some of the work that I do. How does it actually happen? So I'm gonna go through some of my stories later, and this is basically the overall process that goes into it. First is the research and the pitching. When an idea comes to mind, I don't just send it off to an editor and just say, this is what I'm gonna do, or I don't just write it myself too. First, there's a lot of back work that goes into it. I figure out what the idea is, I lay out the groundwork to make sure it's a strong idea, figure out who I might interview, who the experts would be, which publication it makes the most sense with, and if that publication has already covered anything similar. I have to put a lot of work into that, and then I distill that into what's called a pitch, which I send to my editor. That's a few quick paragraphs giving an overview of what the idea is and why they should be covering it. And you have to get really into details. You never just say, hey, I want to go to Paris. Editors hate that. You need to be like, hey, I want to go to Paris and do a story about this neighborhood that nobody ever goes to, but there's been 7 incredibly interesting bakeries that have just opened there, and that's the story, and nobody's covered it yet. I'm going to give you an exclusive. So that's how the pitch part of it works. Once I get the commission, which is the assignment, the story that's been given to me, and they kind of tell you how much they're going to pay, what the budget is for travel, then I have to start planning. And this is all me. Maybe I should finally start hiring an assistant or something, because it is a lot of work. First, there's just the basic logistics. Which flights am I going to take? Do I have to take trains and things domestically when I get there? What is the best use of my time? Which hotels do I want to stay at? How do I get around? And then I figure out who am I going to speak to, reach out to everyone to set up interviews. I, do a lot of planning to make sure, are the places I want to go open on the days that I'm going to be there? Because sometimes you're like, I need to go to this museum today, and that museum is not open today. So I make sure I get all that information done. And then the way I do it is I usually create a spreadsheet and I break out the trip day by day and blocks of time throughout the day, and then I kind of plug in what I'm going to do when. And in that, I also do account for free time and spontaneity, even though it doesn't sound like it. But you always need to have a little bit of flexibility to see what comes your way, but you also can't just go into a place blind with no idea what you're going to do. So then after the planning is when you actually take the trip. That's the most straightforward part. You've already done all the legwork beforehand to kind of have a good itinerary in place. When you're there, you always try to figure out if there's other things or other people you should be speaking to. And then I always take notes by hand in a notebook because I just feel like that gets my creative juices flowing a bit more. I don't know if anyone else feels like that. I can take notes on my phone, but I think when you're writing, there's just a different kind of sensory experience that happens, and it just gets me really creative. So that's what I do when I'm there. And then sometimes when I'm traveling, I actually can take a friend or a family member with me, which is great because it's a free trip for them and I've planned everything and they just kind of tag along. So then after that, when I come back, is the organizing and the writing. So first thing I do, because I take my notes by hand, is I download all of my notes into a Google Doc. Then I start highlighting sections and quotes and parts of the things that I can already see will be the opening or the closing or just ways I kind of envision the story coming together. And that's when I start creating my outline with that. And then after several drafts, I'll kind of finally have it ready to hit send and send to my editor. And that's when the editing cycle begins. So the story is never done when you hit send, because usually the editor is going to come back to you with questions or comments or things you need to clarify. Sometimes there's just more research that you need to do to really kind of find the right point that you're trying to make. And then a lot of magazines will also have a job that's called fact checking, which it's a whole separate team that is there to verify the facts. If I say I had breakfast at this restaurant, they will actually call the restaurant and confirm that the restaurant is open in the morning and actually serves breakfast. So sometimes I need to get a lot of information ready for them. So you're basically still working until the story is ready to go to print. And if it's a digital magazine, then sometimes the story is in print within hours or days of when you finished your edits with the editor. If it's a print magazine like this one, for example, this was from a restaurant in India that I went to in September. So I reported it in September and I filed it. I think the deadline was November. We did edits through January and maybe a little bit into early February. And then it was just in print as of last week. So print can take a lot longer to really get everything ready. And then social media. So I don't use social media in the way content creators do. I'm not creating like snappy reels for my travels, but I do post about my travels a lot. And sometimes it's also really helpful to find sources when I'm traveling, people that I might want to connect with or interview. And it's also, I travel solo a lot. So sometimes when I rock up in a new place, I don't know anyone. It's actually a great way to meet friends and meet people, make friends, and like really connect with locals that I might not necessarily try to seek out if I'm traveling with friends or family. Okay, so now that I've walked through the process, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how some specific stories that I've worked on have come together. So this was a story on Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's in Europe. It's a former Ottoman era colony that is now, part of the Balkans. And it is absolutely beautiful. The reason I pitched this story, so this is a story I pitched to my editor at the New York Times. This was maybe 7 or 8 years ago. There was a lot of anti-refugee sentiment in Europe. I guess there might still be, but at that point it was a lot in the headlines a lot, and people kept talking about Muslims as the other, like they didn't belong in Europe. And this is like an indigenous Muslim country that's in the heart of Europe. So that was something I wanted to explore, but also this was a time all the travel magazines were getting really excited about Croatia, which is an absolutely beautiful country, and so rightfully so, but Bosnia is right next door. I assumed it probably shared some of the beauty, so I was just curious because nobody ever really talked about Bosnia. So that's how that story happened. I pitched that, the editor sent me, and it was honestly just such a beautiful country. I hate the question, what's your favorite country? People ask me that all the time. You're welcome to ask me again after if you want, but this is one of the countries I do talk about a lot because it really left an impact on me. And then someone had guessed Uzbekistan earlier. This is an example of a story that came to me. My editor, Akani Nash Traveler, wanted to do a story on Uzbekistan. So the angle that I found, I didn't just want to do a general Uzbekistan story. I realized, well, I have some Uzbek ancestry. I'm Indian American, but before India, my ancestors were in Uzbekistan, but it's something I know nothing about. So I wanted to sort of trace their footsteps, even if I wasn't able to find my own ancestors. I wanted to sort of understand what was it like to be living in Uzbekistan at the height of the Silk Road in the 16 and 1700s, and that was the angle that I used for this story on Uzbekistan. This is actually probably one of my favorite stories I've ever done. It was 2018, I think, or 2017, and the Muslim ban had just gotten in the news, and so I usually don't write about news stories at all, but I was kind of curious, well, now this is a travel ban, this is kind of my beat, I should see if there's something creative I can do that makes sense for me. So I wanted to write about, as a Muslim American woman, traveling around my own country, because most of my travel, as you've seen from the examples I've given, are actually, I don't usually travel around the US very much. I love any opportunity to get my passport stamped and go explore another country, but I was like, well, why don't I travel around America? There is so much amazing stuff here. So I just wanted to do this classic Americana trip. I went to Graceland in Memphis. I went line dancing in Nashville. I went to rodeo in Wyoming. I went to national parks. I mean, it was just actually, like, they sent me all over the country, basically, to just really kind of explore my own backyard in a way that I never had before. And this, like I said, was my favorite stories. I had a lot of fun with it, and it ended up winning a lot of awards, too. So travel and leisure in the City of Saints. So this story, this is an example of a secondary story. So usually when I travel for most of these assignments, it's on assignment for one story, one place. But as I mentioned, I'm a freelancer, so I can write multiple stories from a destination. And if anything, it's a good way to make ends meet by really getting more stories out of every trip. So the story I was in Ethiopia for was in Addis Ababa, the capital, and I had enough time to add on a little side trip, just as a personal expense, just go see something else. So I picked the city called Harar. It's like an important Muslim center from centuries before. I didn't know nothing about it. I just thought it was interesting. And I went there and I loved it so much that I ended up pitching another story to Travel and Leisure in addition to the assignment I was already doing for the New York Times. And so this story was just kind of exploring that little town and just understanding the history and the culture there. And it ended up also winning some awards, and it was in the Best American Travel Writing Anthology in 2021. What else do we have? Oh, Algeria. So this is an example of an assignment that came to me based on expertise that I have. I'd never been to Algeria before. Not many people have. It's actually one of the more closed-off countries in the world. I think they only have visa-free access to 7 other countries. Probably the most involved visa process I've ever had to do for a trip. But an editor of mine had heard that they were planning on becoming a bit more open to tourism in the years ahead. And so she wanted to send me there, and she chose me because I write about the Middle East a lot, I write about Africa a lot, and so she thought I could have an interesting point of view on Algeria as they open up to tourism. So I went there last fall, and it was actually one of the most unique trips I've ever done because it's so rare when you go somewhere, and I'm sure you guys all see this, you go to popular places and they're filled with tourists, and you're like, I'm in Europe, but everyone here seems to be from my hometown. What is the point? Algeria is a place where I barely saw foreigners the whole time I was there, and it was honestly just amazing to be able to experience a culture like that without any foreign influence in that way. This is another example of a story that came to me. This is a travel magazine called Virtuoso. The editor reached out to me last summer to do a story on the jewelry scene in Jaipur in India. That on the left is it was a cover story. That's the Maharaja of Jaipur. And that is me on the right trying on millions and millions of dollars of jewelry, which is basically I got paid to go to India to try on tons of jewelry. So that was honestly a really fun assignment. And anyone a K-drama or K-pop fan? Anyone? No? Okay, that's interesting. Usually a lot of people are. I discovered K-dramas in the pandemic because obviously as a travel writer who isn't traveling, I was really feeling a lot of loss of exploring the world. And so K-dramas became a way for me to travel because it was something I knew nothing about. I knew nothing about Korean culture, and I felt like I was actually discovering a culture through these shows. And it was just this really fun way for me to feel that passport size hold in my heart. And so as soon as borders reopened, I pitched my editor at Condé Nast Traveler saying, hey, I felt like I really fell in love with this country through the shows, and I really want to go and see what it's actually like. And so we did this story together about exploring Seoul after kind of falling in love with it through these shows. And then, so like I said, I've mainly been a freelance writer, but I did get an opportunity to spend a year in Dubai as editor-in-chief of Condé Nast Traveler Middle East. And that was just a really great challenge and opportunity for me because I'm someone, as I mentioned, I grew up in Saudi Arabia. I do a lot of my reporting is on the Middle East. And so it was a really great way for me to base myself there and really focus on storytelling in that part of the world. And as much as I enjoy freelancing, and I think I prefer freelancing, that was just such a great challenge because you really learn about everything that goes into putting a magazine together, whether it's the advertising side, whether it's coming up with those story ideas and figuring out who the best writer is and not you. So it was a very different side of what I do, but I think it was a really great experience, and it's been something that I still do a lot of Middle East coverage even now that I've moved back. All right, so I'm going to take a break because as you can hear, I'm getting a little out of breath, and try a few more where in the world. So does anyone want to guess where this is? Dubai? No, definitely not Dubai. Argentina? No, but that's a good guess, but no.
Costa Rica.
Nope. This is Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe. Well, I guess Zimbabwe and Zambia. And this one? No. I'll be honest, I don't remember exactly where this is, but this is Switzerland. It's a castle in Switzerland, and I don't remember which town. And this one? Did someone say Iowa? No, definitely not Iowa. No, not Wisconsin either. Little hint, it's not in America. Egypt, no, but right continent. Chad? No, not Chad. That's an interesting guess. Anyone else? No, this is in Namibia. This is in the Dead Flay, which is this the desiccated salt pan surrounded by the Sossusvlei dunes, which are some of the, I think, the tallest dunes in the world. And this one. Not Iceland. What? Not Jamaica. I can't hear anyone else, but this is in Kenya on the Swahili coast in an island called Lamu. These boats are like these distinctive boats that are common in East Africa and also in Oman called dhows. And so a popular thing to do there is go on a sunset dhow cruise. All right, so one thing that I'm personally very passionate about in travel journalism is diversity. I co-founded this platform called Travel is Better in Color with some colleagues a few years ago to really help champion diverse perspectives in travel writing. Like I mentioned earlier, travel writing still has a lot of this colonial hangover, and how that kind of channels today is in who really gets to tell the stories. They often tend to be through one voice or one point of view. So something that I think is really important is to think about who is the best person to tell a story. Sometimes that does mean having, say, an Indian origin writer writing about India, but I also think it's not just about you should write about where you're from. It's also about I want to see more Black writers writing about Japan, or Asian writers writing about Buenos Aires. I think it's just incredibly important for a lot of different points of view to be shined on in all these when you're telling stories about other cultures. And I think the most important thing, no matter who is telling the story of any culture, is to not center yourself, not to make it a how I spent my summer vacation kind of essay. You really want to center the local voices and make sure you're speaking to the right people in these places and really telling the story through their eyes as best you can, because you are a guest in their country and you want to make sure you're honoring their understanding of their country. Because something I always say is one person's exotic is another person's daily commute. So you don't ever want to reduce a place to what your biases might be. All right, and so talk a lot about being a freelancer, so I want to tell you a little bit about the pros and cons. The pros are kind of, it's obvious. I get access to amazing travel. I've been on 25 safaris. Like I said earlier, I've been to 7 continents in 6 months, all on somebody else's dime. I've stayed in some of the most unbelievable hotels, and I think it's just, the perks are definitely there, and they're not to be looked at lightly. There also are other challenges that I'll get to, but it is truly, in a lot of ways, a dream job, and I'm very grateful every day that I get to do this. Unique access. So when you're traveling on vacation, locals will often be nice and friendly, and that everybody's warm and welcoming. But when you're somewhere on assignment, you really get to explore a destination with a whole different kind of lens, because people are really excited to tell you their stories and make sure that you're talking about their country and their culture in the right way. So for example, I was in Tunisia once doing a story on the design scene. And before I got there, I'd reached out to one Tunisian American that I knew. She connected me to one person. When I got there, they connected me to another, and I felt like I was being handed off from one cool Tunisian to the next cool Tunisian, and I was really plugged into this hip insidery crew of people that really knew what was going on. And that's the kind of thing, I don't know if I was just there on vacation, if they would have been that open to me, but because I was working on a story on the craft and what they were trying to do, it really helped me get a whole different level of access to that place. Flexibility, I am not constrained by a 9 to 5. I get to design my own schedule, whether it's travel, whether it's my days at home, however I want. I get to sleep in. I mean, the flexibility, I think, is probably my favorite thing about what I do, because I get to dictate how I want to spend my days. Variety of projects. There really is never a dull day. Sometimes, like I said, I had a story that just came out last week. Right now, I'm working on a coffee table book, and I have a story that's going to come out next week that's in edits. I have 2 stories that are due soon that I'm working on. I'm brainstorming another book idea. I'm doing some voiceovers for a video I shot. So there's just always tons of different things going on, and I love the variety. And at this point in my career, not the beginning of my career, but at this point, I get to only do the stories and projects that I want to do. So earlier in your career, there's a lot of grunt work. There's a lot of different things that you kind of have to do to make ends meet. But now I'm very grateful to be in a place where I select what I want to do. I decline projects that I'm not interested in, and I can just be really selective and do things that make me happy. Cons, though, it's feast or famine. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that phrase, but sometimes when it rains, it pours, and you have more work than you know what to do with, and you're completely overwhelmed, and sometimes it's a complete drought, and you don't know if you're going to be able to pay your bills that month. So you do have to get ready to write it out. There's no answer. There's no solution. I haven't figured it out anyway, and I've been doing this for a long time. But it's just sometimes that's just the way it goes. Sometimes a year are busier than others, and you just have to be able to handle that. There's no benefits or steady salary, so that can be really stressful for some people who need to know exactly how much they're going to make every month. I do make a really good amount of money though, so it's not like you're necessarily, struggling when you do this, but you just have to be ready for the inconsistency. No routine. So last year, I think between August and October, I went to Mallorca, came back, Rwanda, came back, India, came back, Turkey, came back, Algeria, came back, London. So it was just nonstop, and sometimes my schedule is like that. That means there's no routine, I'm not working out regularly, I'm not eating healthy. So sometimes it can just be like you're at the mercy of your schedule, and if you need consistency, that can be really tough. It can take a toll on its health, so you just have to be able to learn when to say no to projects and find the right schedule for yourself. And rejection. You need a thick skin. Even at this point in my career, I'm constantly getting rejections, and some of my stories aren't landing and people just aren't interested. That's just the way it is, and you need to be able to roll with that, and that's just something that no matter, and I think that applies to a lot of these sort of independent careers. You're just always going to have to get used to that and not take it personally and learn to move on to the next thing. And then this is the thing, declining pay rates and struggling titles, that is a reality of the media industry in general. But I would argue that if you have the skill set that comes from being a writer and from working with these kinds of publications, every industry needs good writers. So there are times where I do consulting projects for brands like Airbnb or just other more corporate things. And so I think the skill set will always be in use, even if you're not necessarily using it in the way you intended to initially. So, does anyone want to be a travel writer now? Oh, did I? Is it ready? Oh, sorry guys, I didn't realize I talked that much.